The trail had never been on any official map, yet locals insisted it appeared every few years, carved into the forest floor as if something enormous dragged its weight across the earth. Hikers who stumbled upon it often claimed that it looked too clean. No fallen leaves, no broken branches, no sign of weathering, just a smooth, unnatural path leading into the oldest part of the woods. Most people ignored the rumors, but curiosity had a way of steering restless minds toward danger. The forest felt heavier than usual that evening, the kind of suffocating quiet that settles over a place when every living creature knows something is wrong. The air carried a faint metallic scent, like rusted tools left to rot under rain, and the wind refused to pass through the trees. As the sun lowered behind the mountain ridge, the last rays of light bled through the canopy and revealed the trail, long, straight, and disturbingly perfect. The hiker who found it had been searching for solitude after a difficult week. The untouched path felt welcoming at first, almost inviting him to walk deeper where the forest grew darker and older. But there was something unsettling about the way the ground seemed freshly shaped, not by machines, but by something deliberate, like fingers raking through soft earth. With each step, the sounds of the outside world fell away, until the only thing he could hear was the crunch of soil beneath his boots. Soon, the trail narrowed, the trees pulling in close as though they were trying to hide whatever waited ahead. At certain angles, their trunks appeared twisted, not by wind or time, but by pressure, as if something had gripped them and forced them to bend. The forest floor held no signs of animals, no tracks, no insects, not even the faint buzz of mosquitoes. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. A strange unease settled in his chest when he noticed the footprints. They were human, small and barefoot, pressed deeply into the soil, far deeper than anyone could make without heavy weight. They led forward, perfectly in line, never staggering, never turning back. When he crouched down to inspect them, he realized the impressions were fresh, too fresh. The edges were crisp, as if made moments earlier. He followed them deeper into the narrowing corridor of trees, hoping he might find someone to reassure him. But the farther he walked, the more the forest changed. The trunks grew unnaturally smooth, stripped of their bark, pale and sickly like stretched bone. Roots squirmed beneath the dirt, not growing, but shifting, as though adjusting their positions. Above him, the canopy knit itself tightly, blocking what little sunlight remained. By the time he realized the trail was beginning to close behind him, it was too late. The trees leaned inward, their branches weaving together until the entrance vanished entirely. Panic clawed at him, and he quickened his pace, but the path ahead warped and curved in impossible ways. What had once been straight now snaked and twisted, doubling back on itself without warning. His footprints vanished as soon as he made them, swallowed instantly by the shifting earth. Time became meaningless in that shadowed labyrinth. Hours could have passed, or maybe only minutes. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, slow, dragging movements, as if something massive crawled beneath the soil following him. At times, he felt the ground pulse like a heartbeat beneath his boots. At others, he could swear he heard breathing, long and heavy, rumbling through the roots. Then he saw them. Faces. Hundreds of them pressed into the smooth bark of the trees on either side of the trail. Their features twisted in silent agony, mouths stretched open as though screaming. The more he walked, the more faces he saw, their hollow eyes watching him with desperate warning. The bark around their trapped forms quivered, pulsing like living flesh. Some faces trembled as if they were trying to push through, trapped just beneath the surface. When the trail widened again, he stopped before a clearing. In its center stood a massive tree, ancient and towering, its trunk split open like a rib cage.
Inside the hollow, the walls pulsed with the same sickening rhythm he had felt in the roots. Dozens of footprints, those same deep, barefoot impressions, led directly into its maw. As he backed away, the ground behind him shifted violently. Roots erupted from the soil, curling around his ankles with unbelievable force. The forest no longer hid the truth of itself. It was alive, aware, and hungry. The perfect trail had never been a path. It was bait. The roots dragged him toward the hollow trunk, to the place where countless others had disappeared. As he clawed at the earth, his fingers slipped on soil that felt disturbingly warm. The forest pulsed faster, eager, trembling with anticipation. And somewhere deep within the shifting roots and whispering trees, a new trail began forming, smooth, perfect, and waiting for the next curious soul who would wander too far off the marked path.
For years, the old farmhouse sat at the edge of the fields, its windows dark and its porch sagging from decades of weather and neglect. Outsiders assumed it was abandoned, but the man who lived inside had grown used to the silence that surrounded it. He had chosen the property specifically because isolation made him feel safe. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, and no curious visitors, only the steady sound of wind sweeping through the tall crops at night. But isolation has a way of revealing things that were never meant to be seen. It began with the footsteps, soft, dragging movements across the wooden porch outside his bedroom window. At first, he blamed it on loose boards shifting in the cold, or maybe an animal searching for warmth. But the sound returned night after night, always at the same hour, always slow and deliberate. It never came from the yard, never approached from the fields. It only ever began right there, on the porch, as though the visitor simply materialized from the darkness. The man tried to ignore it, convincing himself that if he refused to acknowledge it, it would eventually stop. But the footsteps grew heavier, more purposeful. Sometimes they paused directly beneath his window, and he swore he could hear breathing, long, rattling, and impossibly close. When he finally gathered the courage to check the porch the following mornings, he found no footprints, no claw marks, no signs of wildlife. Dust and old leaves lay undisturbed, as though nothing had touched the wood in decades. The fields around the house were the only thing that changed. Small paths began appearing in the crops, narrow channels where something had pushed through, heading straight toward the farmhouse. Each night the paths grew closer, weaving through the tall stalks in unsettling patterns. The man tried to convince himself that the wind had done it, or maybe a wandering deer, but the paths were too narrow, too precise. Something intelligent had created them. One night, the footsteps came earlier than usual. The man lay still, the blankets pulled tightly around him as the boards creaked under the weight of whatever had arrived. This time, the breathing was louder, deep enough to rattle the thin glass of the window. He felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. As the minutes stretched on, a soft tapping began, slow, rhythmic taps against the glass, spaced with unnatural precision. He held his breath, afraid that any movement might draw its attention further. But the tapping continued, patient and methodical, as if the thing outside knew he was awake and simply wanted to be acknowledged. When it finally stopped, the footsteps retreated in the same dragging pattern, vanishing into the night. The next day, the man boarded every window and door. He hammered planks into place, sealed cracks, and blocked off the porch entirely.
Yet as night fell, the footsteps returned, this time from inside the walls. The sound traveled through the house, moving slowly from room to room, searching, listening. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but the boards he had nailed shook with each heavy step. The thing he had tried to keep out had already found its way in. The man began to notice other changes. His belongings shifted positions when he wasn't looking. The air in the house grew colder, even though the heater sputtered at full power. Shadows clung to corners long after the lights were turned on, refusing to retreat. And the smell, an overpowering mix of wet soil and decaying foliage, began to fill the rooms, growing stronger each night. Eventually, he realized something terrifying. The thing that visited him didn't break in. It didn't sneak through doors or climb through windows. It simply appeared, as though it always been there, waiting in the space between walls, watching him from inside the house itself. The final night began with complete silence. No footsteps on the porch, no creaking boards, no tapping on the window. For the first time in weeks, the man allowed himself to relax. He convinced himself that the nightmare had finally passed, that whatever haunted the farmhouse had moved on. He climbed into bed, exhausted, and drifted toward sleep. But the silence didn't last. From directly beneath the bed, a slow, deliberate breath rattled through the floorboards. The sound vibrated through the frame, chilling him to the core. Another breath followed, heavier and closer. Then the boards under his mattress began to bow upward, bending not from pressure, but as if something beneath was rising, pushing toward him. The man froze, unable to move, unable to scream, as the wood continued to bulge and crack. A shape pressed from below, tall, thin, and impossible in its outline. He watched in horror as the floorboards splintered open like rotting bone. In the dark gap beneath, he saw nothing but blackness, deeper than any shadow he had ever known. The first thing to emerge was a hand, long, skeletal, and coated in soil. It reached upward, grasping blindly, searching for him. Then another hand followed, and the bed lifted as the creature forced its way into the room, rising slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. The farmhouse remained standing for years after, untouched and rotting quietly at the edge of the fields. But no one ever saw the man again. The only sign he had ever lived there was the narrow path that led from the crops straight to the porch, freshly carved, as if something had dragged itself through the stalks, searching for a new place to wait for nightfall.
I was 29 when this happened, and even now, 2 winters later, I still catch myself avoiding the back windows of whatever place I'm living in. It was the week before Christmas, one of those rare stretches where I took vacation time and decided to stay home, telling myself I needed the quiet more than the travel this year. My family lived only an hour away, but a massive cold front was rolling through the region, and every local forecast had been repeating the same warning for days. One of the coldest December nights in nearly a decade was expected to hit right before Christmas Eve. I stocked up on groceries, filled the car with gas, replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors, and assumed that would be enough preparation. Most of that first day off I spent lounging inside, listening to the howling wind whip at the siding while I tried to relax. The temperature had dropped so quickly that frost had already claimed the edges of every window. When I woke the next morning, snow draped across the yard in uneven waves, like something had walked through the powder before dawn. I told myself it was just the wind carving ridges across the surface,
But something about the pattern looked less like drifting snow and more like narrow, dragging paths. The sky was a dim, bruised gray, barely letting in any light, and despite the early hour, the house felt strangely heavy and silent. I tried to ignore the weird tension by sinking into work on my laptop, telling myself the storm would pass by nightfall. But instead of letting up, it grew worse. By late afternoon, the entire forest behind my property, an endless stretch of tall pines, had become a blur of white. The gusts pummeled the house hard enough to rattle the vents. The cold was so intense that even with the heat running, I could see my breath whenever I stood near the larger windows. At one point, I got up to refill my coffee and glanced out the kitchen window. The tree line, usually a thick, solid border of dark trunks, seemed farther away than usual, almost like the forest had shifted back or the darkness had deepened between the trees. But something else unnerved me even more. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible through the sheets of falling snow, there was a tall shape, standing completely still. A person, or at least something that held the outline of one. They were impossible to make out clearly, but they weren't moving, and there was no reason for anyone to be out there, not in that cold, not in that empty stretch of land behind my house. I stared for a long minute, wiping fog from the glass, trying to determine if it was just a trick of the storm. When I glanced away for a breath and looked back, the shape was gone. That should have been enough for me to call someone, or at least double-check the locks, but I convinced myself it was just a dark branch or shadow shifting in the wind. The night fell early and fast. The storm thickened until I could barely see past the porch. Snow hit the windows in rapid bursts, like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. Around 9, as I sat on the couch trying to focus on a movie, the house made a deep groaning sound, one that didn't fit with the typical settling noises I was used to. It was followed by another, sharper creak that came from the back hallway near the sliding glass door. I muted the movie, listening closely. There was nothing at first, just wind. Then something brushed against the back door. Not hard, not loud, just a slow, dragging scrape. I felt the air in my lungs freeze. The wind shouldn't have made that kind of sound. I got up slowly and walked toward the hallway, every step feeling like it produced too much noise in the cold stillness of the house. I reached the corner where I could see the living room light reflecting on the glass door, but not the outside. The reflection was too bright, the outside too dark. I didn't want to get closer, but the scraping sound came again, a little more insistent, like fingertips trailing across the glass. The hair on my arm stood on end. I returned to the living room, turned off the light, and waited for my eyes to adjust. It took almost a minute for the room to darken enough that I could see the outline of the backyard through the sliding door. Snow swirled violently under the porch light. Beyond that, darkness. But then, just before I turned away, something pale shifted at the very edge of the yard near the trees. A face, or something shaped like a face. It floated in the darkness for only a moment before sinking back into the tree line. I grabbed my phone immediately and called the non-emergency police line. They told me, almost dismissively, that officers were tied up responding to accidents all over town because of the blizzard. They suggested I lock everything, keep lights on, and call again if something escalated. After hanging up, I checked every window and lock twice. By the time I finished, the storm had thickened into an almost impenetrable wall of white. The house felt like it was shrinking around me, each gust outside echoing inside the walls. Just after midnight, the power went out. Not slowly, not with a flicker, just a sudden, total drop into blackness. The warm hum of the vents died instantly, leaving the house feeling cavernous and hollow. I stayed frozen in place at first, listening to the silence settle in. And then, the unmistakable sound of snow crunching under footsteps outside the back door. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath and lowered myself to the floor, crawling behind the couch so I wouldn't be visible from any windows. The footsteps grew louder, coming around the side of the house. Something brushed the siding, like a hand dragging across the exterior wall. Then a faint thud near the bathroom window. Then another at the kitchen window. They were circling the house. I didn't dare move. The temperature dropped sharply without the heat running, and soon the cold was biting through my clothes. It felt like hours passed, though it couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 minutes. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again, except for the wind. I stayed where I was, curled behind the couch, until the first hint of dawn light began to seep through the front windows. The storm had finally slowed. When I gathered enough courage to stand and look outside, I saw dozens of footprints circling the house in uneven trails, some leading from the tree line, others back toward it, but none coming from the road. The police came that later morning, after power had been restored. They followed the footprints to the edge of the forest before losing them completely in deep snow. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing damaged, nothing missing. They suggested it might have been a lost hiker, someone confused in the storm. But no hiker would stand motionless in sub-zero temperatures for hours. No hiker would circle a house repeatedly without knocking, without seeking help. And certainly no hiker would leave prints stretching from far beyond the visible tree line, prints that led back into the forest at angles no normal person would voluntarily take in that cold. When the officers left, I stood at the sliding door again, staring into the trees. The snow was calm now, light flakes drifting down gently. The forest looked normal, unmoving. But for just a split second, I thought I saw a pale shape slip between the trunks, farther back than any of the prints had gone. Taller than any person should have been. It disappeared before I could be sure I saw it at all. I moved out 2 months later and never returned. To this day, I still avoid looking too long at tree lines in winter. Every time the wind whistles across a window or frost patterns crawl up the glass, I remember that pale shape standing in the dark, watching my house from the edge of the woods, waiting for the coldest night to come closer.